The Nvidia GeForce GTX 1070 was an absolute gaming beast when it released back in June of 2016. And despite its age, its popularity hasn't dwindled, and was actually making a comeback before all this crazy GPU pricing started. Before, you'd be able to find one of these cards at less than $200, which is incredible considering I paid $329 for the card I've got here back in 2019. But with the crypto boom, supply issues, and the ridiculous pricing that they've brought along with them, you're now looking at a price tag more around $300 to $500 on a good day. Once this bubble bursts again, prices will come back down, and in preparation for that, let's take a look at the GTX 1070 in 2021, and see if this card is worth keeping an eye out for once prices finally stabilize. In typical Proceu tech fashion, let's start off with the hardware specifications of the card and discuss the different requirements you would need in order to run the card in your system. In terms of the silicon in this card, we're presented with a cut down GP104 die. This means we're getting an overall backbone similar to that of the higher end GTX 1080, with a feature set more in line with the GTX 1060. You're getting the aesthetics of the 1080 as well, which with this specific flavor is definitely a good thing. This also brings us to power requirements, which for this card has a rated TDP of 150 watts, and a recommended PSU of 450 watts. To be safe, I would go for at least a 500 watt unit, especially if you plan on overclocking the card to anything beyond stock clocks. But to get the card up and running, a 450 watt unit is all you need. A 600 watt unit is probably what I'd recommend if you need the utmost stability, however. Power connectors, once again for the card, are also relatively basic and speak to the card's relative efficiency when compared to its Turing and Ampere-based successors. This card draws most of its watt through the PSU cables rather than the PCIe slot on the motherboard, which helps with compatibility on older boards. It should be noted, however, that this specification can change from vendor to vendor, and even depending on the flavor. Some require an 8+6 pin, while others may require all the way up to two 8-pin connectors, so it's important to check the listing for the card you're looking at to ensure compatibility. Overclocking on this model is also not recommended as it's the reference flavor, meaning thermal dissipation isn't this card's strong suit. Speaking of clocks though, this card has a stock clock of 1506 MHz and a rated boost clock of 1683 MHz. In-game, clocks usually hovered around the 1800 MHz mark, with 1792 MHz coming up quite frequently. However, as time went on, the clocks began to droop down to the rated boost clock due to thermal limitations. It's not anything to be worried about, however this does bring into question the value of a hybrid mod or buying a flavor with a larger heatsink. This is the reference design after all, and it's important to keep in mind that the heatsink is only about roughly the size of a soda can. Cosmetically, I also modded my card and printed the metal parts of the shroud in opaque gold color, which looks kind of tacky but doesn't affect thermal performance. I was bored one weekend and decided to paint it. That's really the only explanation I can give, but it was a fun little mod. Moving into the feature sets of the card, the GTX 1070 has most of the modern extensions, however it does lack ray tracing and tensor cores. For strictly gaming without DXR, this isn't really a big deal. However, if you were looking to get into DLSS, then this card is not the best choice. In fact, it's not even an option on this card. During the current price hike, if you need DXR for a specific workload, then the RTX 2060 is probably the go-to card at the moment, even though it's a bit pricey. While yes, this card is technically capable of ray tracing, it does so in software, meaning it's beyond slow, even for a basic recursive implementation. Jumping into rasterization performance, and the GTX 1070 packs in 1920 CUDA cores, each being capable of either a 32-bit floating point or 32-bit calculation per clock cycle. This is a quirk in the design of the entire 10 series, and if you're familiar with my GTX 1080 review, that card is the exact same way. All Pascal cards have this feature, and it ultimately limits the amount of mixed data type computations that can be carried out. In performance terms, it doesn't lead to any significant issues when gaming. However, it is limited in terms of FP16 and FP64 compute, both of which are common in scientific and workstation use cases. If you're going to be running protein folding simulations or doing some hard, high-precision math, then the GTX 1070 might be best left to the gamers, because this card just doesn't have the horsepower. Hell, even the card's bigger brother from this generation struggles in those workloads as well. If you're really into heavy compute, then I would suggest a Touring card if integer workloads are a big part of your workflow, and Ampere if you're looking for tons of FP32 and FP16 power. The cache structure found in this card is also incredibly similar to the pipeline found in Maxwell 2.0, with 48 kilobytes of L1 cache per SM and an overall shared L2 size of 2 megabytes. Compared to more modern offerings such as the RTX 3070, this amount of cache is tiny and limits the amount of data that can be processed at once. Less cache means more of the data has to be stored in the card's VRAM, meaning the 1070 is overall less efficient with its memory allocation. And this compounded with the lower bandwidth of GDDR5 leads to this card's ultimate Achilles heel, that being the memory configuration. Rocking 8 gigs of GDDR5 split into 8 1GB chips, this card makes use of a 256-bit bus, with clocks on the memory allowing for 8 gigabit per second on the chips, and 256 gigabytes per second on the GPU. Just for comparison's sake, this card's memory configuration was actually excellent for the time, and allowed the card to fully saturate a nice, wide pipeline. In the years since, GDDR6 has moved the base bandwidth up to 448 gigabytes per second, putting the 1070's memory a solid 42% behind the configuration found in the RTX 2070. In-game, what you'll notice is more frame dips in the GTX 1070 when particle effects fill up the screen. However, the GPU 104 chip itself is ultimately being held back by the memory configuration. I wish there was a way to see how this card could perform with GDDR5X, because the specs of the chip itself are still rather impressive and rather capable. With the 15 SMs on board, we get 120 texture mapping units and 64 rasterization operation pipelines. The TMUs are definitely being held back here by the lack of on-die cache and the slower memory, meaning they can't do their job as effectively as they possibly could. But the overall age of the 1070's G5 configuration is holding it back from being a no-brain recommendation. Sure, it's got 8 gigs, which is plenty for 1440p and 1080p gaming, but in newer games where particle effects are used extensively, the 1070 will start to struggle a bit more, as it lacks the high levels of bandwidth found in its GDDR6-based successors. This card also lacks the memory compression algorithms found in Ampere. However, delta color compression is in use here and really helps to keep the 1070 and its Pascal brethren more in line with modern cards. Overall, the feature set is the gold standard Nvidia setup, minus ray tracing. For some of us, this isn't that big of a deal, as while technically impressive and graphically stunning, it's so costly that some of us prefer to just use traditional rasterization to get the job done instead. The memory configuration is what's theoretically holding the cores back the most, however, techniques introduced by Nvidia can help to mitigate this, along with a slight memory overclock. Just by looking at the spec sheet of the 1070, it's easy for your mouth to start watering, especially so when its implications for gaming start to get involved. This brings us to the specifications of our test system and our methodology for capturing the numbers we'll be discussing. For our CPU, we'll be rocking the beastly Intel Core i9-9900K, an 8-core 16-thread chip, socketed in my MSI Z390A Pro motherboard. Along with our CPU, we paired it with 32 gigs of DDR4, utilizing 2933 megatransfers per second. Kind of an unusual transfer rate, however I'm running them undervolted to cut down on heat, and it's an overclock anyways as our 9900K comes stock with a 2666 MHz controller. I switched out my GTX 1080 with the GTX 1070, however I will be testing with the stock cooler and not with the water cooling setup. Either way, we've isolated GPU performance to help give us an idea as to where the 1070 sits in the power ladder and whether it's worth picking up. In order to test our card, we also ran all our games at 1440p for 10 minutes, with the graphical values set to their high values. This helps to stress the GPU more so than the CPU, and is also a middle ground between 1080p and 2160p. It's also important to keep in mind that performance will look even better if you're planning on gaming at 1080p, but for the benchmarks, all the games will be presented in 1440p. With the specifications and testing sequence out of the way, let the benchmarks begin. Overall, the GTX 1070 is still a very competent graphics card that packs tons of computational power into a silicon chip the size of a nickel. While the GPU cores themselves are powerful and can tackle most modern AAA games with ease, the memory configuration is what's holding us back. Even though this memory configuration was the gold standard when this card came out, keep in mind that it came out, 5 years ago. Most older cards will struggle with high amounts of sprites, and this is due more to the clock speed of the memory rather than the bus widths. On a more modern GDDR6 configuration, you're getting memory chips that run at a minimum of 14 gigabit per second. On this GDDR5 configuration, we've got 8 gigabit per second. You can probably now see why I've been repeatedly bringing up the memory configuration, and it's mostly because its age. As we continue to move forward, GDDR6 will become the standard for video cards, which, while being a good thing, also means that hardware gets left behind. For gaming at 1080p, this card has more than enough bandwidth to shred any modern title. However, once the resolution starts to go up, that's where we start to see some struggling. 1440p, while definitely doable on many of our test games, also crippled our card in 2 of our games, Cyberpunk 2077 and Metro Exodus, leaving me more comfortable recommending this card for 1080p gaming and light workstation use. Speaking from personal experience, I've been using this card in my render machine for just over a year now, and while it's not the fastest or newest kid on the block anymore, it puts up one hell of a fight and is able to hold its own in games that should in theory not be running as well as they are. If we want to make a comparison, imagine trying to run a game from 2015 on a card that came out in 2010. It would run but be incredibly slow. The 1070 doesn't suffer from this thankfully, and with its lower hash rates, also is not being targeted by miners quite as frequently. This all ultimately begs the question, however, is the GTX 1070 worth picking up in 2021? Well, right now with the inflated pricing, not particularly. But as pricing goes down, so will the price of this card, and in time we'll be back down to the pre-2020 levels. Once this happens, then it's 110% worth pulling the trigger on one of these cards, despite the negative aspects I've discussed at length. With 6.5 teraflops of FP32 compute, this card is competitive with the Xbox Series S and Xbox One X, despite its much older architecture and higher power draw. If you're able to find a 1070 at or around the $200 mark, then it's an absolute steal and is definitely worth checking out. It's an amazing card that offers strong FP32 compute, a high memory capacity, and a sweet spot in terms of efficiency. Keep an eye out for the 1070 if you're in the market for a graphics card, because one might be lurking nearby.